Walls of Destiny. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Fugitive. Proving his innocence would have to wait for a later time, a much later time. It had only been 3 days since the fire, and formal charges had already been brought against him. They were looking for him, and he knew it. He had already made the preparations for his departure. Supplies for the journey were purchased, his train ticket secured, and goodbyes whispered under the cover of night. The only thing left to do was to make it to the train in one piece. He looked up at the clouds as he proceeded toward the wooded path behind his home, a back way that would bring him close to the train station. The air was heavy with the impending rain and the distinct electrical smell that often precedes thunderstorms. Atlantia was in the midst of the rainy season, and the ground had already dried from the last downpour. Judging by the clouds, the ground would be muddy again soon, making it easier for the authorities to track him. He'd have to move quickly. The storm was rolling in from the southeast, spun off from the hurricane nearly 200 miles out at sea, beyond the bay where he would often fish. Shouldering his pack, he plunged deeper into the humid embrace of the forest path. He wondered if he would be able to blend in with the throngs of travelers that gathered at the train station heading to the Great Walled City for the upcoming holiday season. This year, in particular, the Walled City would be a magnet for travelers who would converge to celebrate the centennial of the land's unification. 100 years prior, King Ariad Idriaxis had bridged the east and west with his vision, extending the railroad tracks all the way to Atlantia. His legacy was so profound that the new calendar's first year began on the day of his death. This centennial celebration cast a shadow over a second, more subdued holiday of religious significance, which, by coincidence, fell on the same day. He lifted his tunic slightly to ease the damp fabric sticking to his skin due to the humidity. Part of him just wanted it to rain so the humidity would break. He felt a sense of relief as the wind began to pick up, cooling his body. He was halfway out of the woods when he approached the clearing where another path leading directly into town intersected the path he was on. He didn't like it. It was wide open at the intersection, and he could be too easily seen. Cautiously he approached, scanning as far left and right as he could see. Suddenly, 2 people emerged off in the distance on the path straight ahead of him. He froze momentarily, studying the two. His worst fears materialized as he recognized them as constables from his village. They called out to him. "Mylo," said one. "Stop, in the name of the law," said the other as they quickened their pace. For Mylo, stopping was not an option. There was no way to prove his innocence rotting in a jail cell. With a surge of adrenaline, he veered left onto a narrow path that led to the village, his legs pumping with a controlled speed. The plump officers lagged behind, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. Within minutes, he was in Finnmark's downtown area, a quiet bustle of last-minute preparations for the storm. Approaching the main street, he turned right, toward the train station. When he turned to check on his pursuers, they were much closer than he had estimated. They called out to another constable up ahead that Mylo hadn't seen. The third one was ahead of Mylo, blocking his path. He turned and ran down an alleyway, and the 3 officers gave chase. In desperation, Mylo broke into a full sprint and turned down another side street, losing them. "I've got to make them think I've left the village," he thought. He shimmied up an old, rusted drainpipe on the side of one of the buildings and made his way to the roof. Here he had a better vantage point, peering over the sides to watch them. They weren't falling for it. They began sweeping the area, going into buildings and asking questions. He could make out the train to the west from his position of the rooftop. Time was running out. He had to get there, but they were scrutinizing the building which Mylo was atop of for much longer than Mylo was comfortable with. "Cobb," one of the constables shouted. "I know you can hear us. Come and face justice. We know it was an accident. The judge will show you leniency if you come quietly." Lying swine, thought Mylo, for everyone knew the fire had been intentionally set. "By the Norn, just leave," he whispered. The seconds were ticking away. The train bellowed the final warning horn before leaving. "What am I going to do?" he again whispered, his eyes darting around in desperation, waiting for some idea to come to him. The thought of his uncle and his crazy stories of his adventures out west entered his mind. He remembered the tales of magic his uncle would tell. Mylo didn't know much about such things, but he sure could use a bit of magic right about now. He saw some horses not far from him and thought, if I can make it to one of the horses, I might be able to catch the train. Second-guessing himself, he whispered, "A wonderful horse theft. Sure, why not add that to my rap sheet as well?" He inched his way to the front of the building where a set of stairs along the wall ran up to the 2nd floor. After assessing the position of the officers, he carefully moved to the edge of the roof and began to lower himself down. Just then, a rock or piece of roof tile was knocked free by his movements and crashed to the ground below. "On the roof." "He is on the roof," one of them shouted. They started to run around to the front of the building. Panicked, Mylo released his grip and allowed himself to fall onto the stairs. One of the officers approached the bottom of the stairs just as Mylo began to descend. The officer was at the bottom of the stairs. Mylo quickly got up on the railing, which was slick with dew from the humidity. He pushed forward, sliding down the railing with his feet extended out. He knocked the officer onto his back as he jumped off the railing. As fast as he could, he sprinted toward the horses, the constables in hot pursuit. As the officers called out for him to stop, he leapt onto the horse, pulled out a knife, and frantically cut the rope tethering the beast to a post. He grabbed the reins and gave the horse a tap. "Go!" he cried. The horse began to move, and Mylo directed it toward the train station. The constables commandeered the 2 remaining horses and resumed the pursuit. Mylo looked back briefly. They were a good distance away, but they were skilled riders. He made his way back to the main street and was now heading west, toward the station. Mylo saw a plume of dark smoke billow out of the steam engine, signaling that the train was about to move. "I'm going to miss the train," he thought as he encouraged the horse to move quicker, his light brown hair flowing in the wind. There was a crowd ahead who had gathered to watch the train as it would disappear into the horizon, carrying its cargo of brave souls into the unknown reaches of Cameria. He shouted for them to get out of the way as he sped closer. Responding to the speeding horses coming toward them, the crowd gave way, though Mylo had to slow slightly, allowing the pursuing constables to gain on him. The train's wheels began to squeak, turning slowly at first before gradually picking up speed. Mylo reached the weathered brick train station, and the crowd, behind him now, became aware of the chase and began chanting and cheering for Mylo. They didn't know him or why the chase was happening, but they enjoyed the excitement that complemented their morning's entertainment. The train began to accelerate to its cruising speed, and Mylo was getting closer. The fast-moving storm clouds were now right over the village. The sound of thunder crashing, married with the rumble of the train, was intense and surreal. Mylo glanced behind at his pursuers, a flash of lightning not too far away catching his eye. He was gaining on the train, but he could feel the horse beginning to tire. The constables were almost upon him now. He pulled up alongside the rear of the train, and in one swift movement, he swung his leg over the horse and fell toward the moving train. He caught the railing that wrapped around the rear of the train with one hand and held it as tight as he could. Pulling himself up, he flung himself over the railing, onto the small deck where passengers would enter and exit. The officers signaled in vain, trying to get the driver's attention to stop the train. They either did not see them or did not want to be bothered. After a few moments, they forfeited their pursuit and fell away. Mylo gasped to catch his breath and knocked at the rear door, hoping someone was watching and would let him in. As it turned out, many of the passengers were watching, some taking bets on whether he'd make it, and some cheering for him. He was immediately let in and given a hero's welcome as some collected on their bets. Exhausted, he set his pack down and settled into one of the seats at the rear. He had barely caught his breath when he was approached by the car's steward. "Though we appreciate your dramatic entry, sir, we still require a ticket for you to be on this train," said the steward. "Yes, of course," breathed Mylo as he produced the ticket. As the steward took the ticket, he noticed the tattoo on Mylo's outstretched arm, a hammer resting on top of an anvil, the sign of an Atlantean metalworker. "Thank you and enjoy the ride," said the man. Mylo looked out at his hometown of Finlark, dwindling in the distance, now engulfed by the deluge. The memories of the town he had lived in his whole life would linger long after it was out of sight. He wondered if he would ever be able to return, if he'd ever be able to prove his innocence. Someday, he thought as he felt a tap on his shoulder. "What was all that about back there?" asked a dark-haired young man about the same age as Mylo. "It's a long story," replied Mylo. "The name is Don J. Vinterman," said the young man. Mylo was a common enough name in these parts, but the name Cobb would have to be left behind. It was doubtful that they would send bounty hunters for him, but it was best that he not be associated with the name. "Mylo," he replied. "Mylo C. Leadbeater," he said with a degree of hesitation. The journey to the walled city would span 4 long days, with numerous stops along the way. Mylo settled into his seat, bracing himself for the long ride ahead. Inside the train, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Passengers chatted animatedly, their voices a symphony of laughter and anticipation. Many were traveling to the walled city for the centennial celebration, a festival renowned for its grandeur. This year's New Year celebration promised to be more spectacular than ever before. Mylo pulled out a book he had brought along for the trip, a bestiary of central Midlandia. It detailed the myriad of creatures one might encounter across the land. While most of the beasts described were known to exist, some were rarely, if ever, seen. As he flipped through the pages, trying to ignore the enthusiastic chatter around him, he came across a creature that filled him with dread. In Atlantia, it was known as the waterfowler. In the west, it was called Imela Intuka. This sinister beast was described as having glowing red eyes and a single, menacing horn. Its massive black body was adorned with brown and orange markings like that of a salamander's, and growths on its back resembled twisted tree branches, making it appear as a floating log while it stalked its prey. Mylo recalled a chilling childhood rhyme meant to deter children from swimming alone. "Down by the river the little children play. Down beneath the surface, the waterfowler lay. Listens to them swim. Listens to them play and sing. Silent and patient it waits. For a full stomach it knows they will bring. Down beneath the surface, hunger in its eyes. Down by the lake a little child dies." A shiver ran down Mylo's spine as he closed the book, his childhood fears momentarily resurfacing. 2 days into the journey, exhaustion from the heat and the cramped quarters began to take its toll on all. Mylo drifted into a restless slumber, visions of the walled city he had only seen in books swirling through his dreams. He imagined himself gliding effortlessly through the city's grand halls and vibrant streets, through the bustling food courts, the roaring arena, and Idriaxland's vast great library. It all felt so familiar, yet oddly surreal. Abruptly, his dreamscape shifted. Mylo found himself in the train's engineer's seat, confusion clouding his mind. A sign ahead read, "Bridge under construction, 1 mile." Panic surged as he searched for the brake lever, but his arms were paralyzed, refusing to move. Brake lever, where is it?" he muttered frantically, trying both arms in vain. Another sign appeared, "Bridge under construction, half mile." Sweat beaded on his forehead as the enormity of the situation sank in. The Norn have abandoned me, he thought desperately. How could they leave me here? He called out mentally to Verdand, the god of the present, pleading for help. The voices behind him grew frantic. Pull the brake. Pull the brake. Yet Mylo remained powerless. His mind raced with fear. All these people will die because of me. In his panic, he thought, maybe I'm too far from home for the Norn to reach me. The bridge loomed closer, the screams of the passengers growing louder. Then, a powerful voice boomed. Stop, the command echoed, followed by laughter from the seat behind him. Mylo jolted awake, disoriented and drenched in sweat. He took deep, calming breaths, finally realizing he had been dreaming. Last stop. Last stop before Central Midlandia, announced the driver in a nasally tone, pulling Mylo back to reality. The rusty metal wheels of the train screeched and groaned as the lumbering machine came to a slow stop. Mylo adjusted his shirt, which clung to his skin from the sweat of the dream he'd just had. The meaning of the dream weighed on him as passengers began to stand and exit the train. He recalled an old saying, always a Norn except from darkness to morn. It suggested that the Norn controlled humanity like puppet masters by day, but by night, in dreams, they too rested. Some believed that dreams revealed a truer self and that their messages should be heeded. Mylo was convinced that his dream held a message, and it would linger in his thoughts for some time. In the old mining village of Grable, a handful of people boarded and some disembarked. It was still about 500 miles to the walled city of Idriaxland, where Mylo would eventually exit the train for the last time. Taking advantage of the brief stop, Mylo stepped off the train and inhaled the dry, dusty air. He walked north along the main road, not far from the train, where the ox and pick supply shop stood. Memories flooded back of his father, the refreshing water from the shop after a day of playing around the mine, and campfire stories of adventure and buried treasures of gems and rare metals. These nostalgic thoughts invigorated him, filling him with renewed resolve and excitement for the adventures ahead. Mylo's gaze was irresistibly drawn to the road leading to the mine. Almost unconsciously, he began walking toward it, captivated by its mystery. Just as he neared the mine, the train horn blared, signaling its departure, snapping Mylo from his trance. Reluctantly, he turned back and hurried to the train. All aboard, called the engineer, and with a jolt and a puff of smoke, the train started moving once more. Normally, the train would make one more stop at the city of River's Edge, the last station before entering Chimeria's central region of Midlandia. However, recent attacks by fearsome waterfowler had made a stop there too dangerous. Do you see any waterfowler? One person said as he raced to the window and gawked through it. Will they attack the train? Asked an anxious woman. Everyone, including Mylo, looked out the window hoping to catch a glimpse of the beasts. However, the only thing that could be seen from the train was an overturned wagon and a good number of soldiers armed with crossbows and long spears. As the train passed through River's Edge, the excitement shifted from the threat of the waterfowler to the anticipation of crossing the mighty river Orlik, which marked the boundary between the western lands and Atlantia. Mylo's heart raced with anticipation as the train crossed the bridge. This was the farthest away from home that he had ever been. Though many on board were likely feeling the same thrill, they kept their excitement subdued. The looming transition to Ashdorn, the land of ash and ancient volcanic activity, intrigued Mylo. The once barren wasteland was known for its inhospitable conditions, but it was also the gateway to new adventures. After passing through Ashdorn, the landscape gradually transformed from flat, rocky wastelands dotted with sparse yellow-green grass to lush, mountainous forests. The mountains seemed to grow larger with each passing mile, towering over Mylo with a grandeur he had never before witnessed. Beyond these southern peaks lay the land of untold horrors and abominations, according to local lore. As the journey wore on, restlessness began to set in among the passengers. Games had lost their charm, legs grew cramped, and the air was thick with the stench of pipe and cigar smoke and sweat. Some travelers indulged in alcoholic beverages to pass the time, and even Mylo, who seldom drank, took a glass or two of beer. Though he typically avoided conversation with strangers, he felt obliged to the folks who opened the train door for him, and the alcohol lowered his guard enough to chat with those seated around him. At the front of the train car, a group started singing a well-known song from their school days. The tune, sung with varying degrees of sarcasm, enthusiasm, and boredom, was one that Mylo had always found irksome. In lands of old, where tongues did clash, King Ariad rose, with courage to smash. He forged a bond 'neath one shared tongue, a realm of unity where all belong. With steady hand and fearless might, he built anew 'neath day and night. His stature tall, his heart so brave. Ariad's name, our lands shall save. In Chimeria's light we stand as one, beneath the gaze of the morning sun. With every beat of our united heart, we sing the praise of our king's noble art. Through walled cities strong, we thrive and soar, defending against the southern roar. King Ariad's legacy forever shall stand, a beacon of hope throughout our land. Cheers to adventure, to treasure, and to friendship. The rowdy bunch toasted, their voices ringing with joviality. Mylo shared their enthusiasm for the journey and the walled city, but the celebratory song's exaggerated praises made him want to spit out his beer. The remaining hours of the journey seemed interminable, though the passing landscapes were undeniably breathtaking. There were 3 more stops before reaching Idriaxlan. The first was at Doka, the capital of the United Lands of Chimeria, situated on the nebulous border between Ashdorn and central Midlandia. 2 imposing men dressed in black, their faces obscured by their wide-brimmed hats, disembarked from the train. They exchanged a mysterious package with a 3rd man, who boarded the train with it. Rumors about the package and the shadowy figures quickly spread among the restless passengers, becoming the latest topic of fascination. Mylo passed the time by drifting in and out of sleep, his weary mind plagued by strange dreams and disjointed images. Tensions ran high on the train, and about half an hour before his stop, he was jolted awake by a fistfight near the middle of the train car over a spilled glass of water. The altercation was quickly quelled with no injuries, prompting Mylo to think, there's always somebody. Most of the remaining passengers were bound for the walled city, and the air buzzed with their relief. Not much longer now, one man said, while another added, I thought I'd go mad. Mylo shared their sentiments, feeling a surge of anticipation at the threshold of a new chapter in his life. His mind raced with thoughts of the future. He glanced down at his boots to steady himself. Focus, Mylo, focus, he said to himself as he pulled out a city map, began plotting where to seek work and find accommodation. The train came to a gradual stop. Last stop before Railsville, announced the driver. Railsville was where the tracks destined for Atlantia were constructed and maintained. Mylo had read extensively about Railsville and had often imagined himself working on the old trains there. Although only those with top security clearances could access her access panels and inner workings, rumors spoke of a dwarf-like race, the Baruni, who had built the trains. According to lore, the last of them perished over 100 years ago due to their dwindling numbers, a result of the Great Plague that swept across the land centuries earlier, but there were always claims of sightings in the wilderness. The Baruni were known for their exceptional engineering skills and love for gems and precious minerals, their skills surpassing even the wisest of wizards. Their abandoned mines and mountain fortresses were said to be ripe for exploration by daring adventurers. Mylo arrived in Idriaxis Pass, a small village suburb of Idriaxlan, set up primarily to profit from naive travelers. The air was thick with the smell of smoky grilled meats and baking bread. The narrow, dusty streets echoed with the chatter of sales pitches and promises of bargains from food stalls, weaponsmiths, and gift shops. A main path ran east to west alongside the railroad, with another leading south into the lowlands. Shifty-eyed beggars and sinister-looking brigands loitered at every corner. Most travelers clumped together in small groups, and Mylo felt exposed as he surveyed the stark reality of the village. The warmth and friendliness of the countryside he once cherished seemed a distant memory. He hoped the walled city would offer a more welcoming atmosphere. Hunger gnawed at him, outweighing his better judgment to keep moving north toward the city. The wind seemed to conspire with the vendors, directing the enticing aromas of exotic cuisines toward hungry travelers. As Mylo approached the east-west road to cross, he narrowly avoided being trampled by a speeding camel. The beast's dust and wind hit him as the driver shouted, "Are you blind?" Stunned, Mylo paused to collect himself, then looked both ways twice before crossing the dusty road toward the source of the tempting smells. At the food stand, Mylo knew the prices were inflated, but the vendors knew that if you were hungry enough, you would pay the price. He approached the safest-looking vendor and studied the menu with an air of calm, as to make it seem as though he was less desperate for sustenance. Finally, he ordered, "I'll take 2 beef kebabs, please." "That will be 10 cedros," the vendor said, barely looking up from his grill. "But the sign says 2 kebabs for 8, Mylo pointed out. "That was yesterday's deal. Fran must have forgotten to take down the sign. Today's price is 2 for 10, the vendor replied with impatience. Frustration bubbled within Mylo. "I'll give you 9 cedros, and you might want to remove that sign," he said, his irritation evident. The vendor glanced around nervously before accepting the offer. "Fine, 9 cedros." He handed Mylo a bag with the food, casting wary glances at the surrounding crowd. Mylo moved to a nearby well to enjoy his meal, but recoiled at the sulfuric stench emanating from it. "Ugh, no thank you," he muttered, opting instead to drink from the small supply of water he had brought with him. He acknowledged the simultaneous tension and fatigue in his body and slumped himself back, leaning on the well. He took a deep breath and prepared to eat. Before he could take a bite, he felt a presence next to him and a dry, slurred voice. "You there?" "You have stolen my horse," said a scruffy, dirty-looking man as he swayed drunkenly. "I saw you sneaking around the stables." "Excuse me, sir?" asked Mylo. "I say, you stole my Horse, repeated the intoxicated fellow. I haven't stolen anything. I have just arrived here, said Mylo. Yeah, I think you did, said the man. No, sir, said Mylo nervously. The man moved closer to Mylo until their noses were nearly touching. Yeah, he said as he breathed his alcohol-permeated breath into Mylo's face. Mylo was confused. He wasn't sure what to do. He slowly placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. This man didn't seem like the type to be reasoned with, but Mylo had never had to use a sword in combat before. He wasn't even sure if he had it in him to do so. I need the horse, continued the man in a slur. But I don't began Mylo before two men came up behind the drunkard and ushered him away. No one stole your horse, Phineas. You're drunk. Your horse is right where you left him, said one of the men as they left. Mylo breathed a sigh of relief as the distant echo of the drunkard's protesting faded into the background. As Mylo tried to process what had just happened, he looked around and realized that a sizable number of villagers had been watching the incident and seemed disappointed that no real action had taken place. He reached down to grab his bags and realized he had dropped one of the overpriced kebabs in the sand. The stench of the drunken man still hung in the air, and Mylo was no longer in the mood to eat anyway. He slung his bag over his shoulder and headed northward, marching toward his destination. A toothless old man wearing a farmer hat and dirty tattered brown clothes leaning on an old wooden post eyed Mylo as he walked. He tipped his hat to Mylo as he spoke in a high reedy voice. Hey there, young man, you're new here, aren't you? Said the old-timer. Yes, sir, he answered, pausing and halfway turning to look at the man. I've lived in these parts my whole life, began the old man. I know these lands well. You might say I am a sort of guide. I can safely get you anywhere you need to go around here. And for a very fair price. No thank you, said Mylo cautiously. I know where I'm going. Mylo continued north and the man followed, still trying to convince Mylo that he needed his services. That you may, sunshine, that you may. But let me warn you, best you get there before dark. Why, just last night, a pack of adolescent moss lurkers were spotted not far from where we stand. Fierce creature there unless you know how to handle them, warned the man as he made a crushing motion with his fist. Realizing that Mylo wouldn't be using his services, the old man stopped walking and offered a last bit of advice. Sand spiders and other bothersome critters come out at night as well, he said, raising his voice to compensate for the distance Mylo was putting between them. Do be careful. Good luck, friend. Mylo, slightly raised his arm and barely looking back, gave a brief thanks and kept on moving. The road going north soon turned into a 20-foot wide, neatly maintained trail with one side for horse and wagons, and the other side, a footpath. The trail cut through a forest thinly filled with rows of beautiful well-manicured evergreen trees. It was a pleasant hike except for the mild uphill grade, which was intentionally built up because the walled city was built high up on a hill for protection during those turbulent times of war. Thankfully, those days are gone. The longer, less steep grade made it much more convenient for merchants and tourists to access the city. There were a few others on the trail. One or two of them, Mylo thought he'd recognize them from the train, but they were a bit too far away to be certain. It isn't safe to venture out by oneself, sounded a voice from behind, startling Mylo. Mylo whirled around to see if the surprise warning was meant for him. He saw a friendly, smiling-faced man who had a similar build and features as himself, looking at him which reminded him of an uncle he had. Or rather a friend of his father's who referred to himself as Mylo's uncle. Thomas R. Tillman is the name, said the man in a familiar Atlantean accent. Mylo Leadbeater, he replied, with a smile, as they continued on the path. This is your first time going to the walled city, I presume, said Thomas, confidently. Mylo nodded and glanced briefly at the man. A man driving large horse pulling a wagon trotted past them and waved before heading east on a narrow path ahead. Correct, said Mylo. He noticed that Thomas's eyes were fixated on the horse and wagon that passed them. I have come here mainly to find work. I may dash. Thomas interrupted, apparently not interested in Mylo's mission. Do you know how long I've lived here? He asked as he broke his gaze from the direction of the horse and wagon. Taken by surprise by the strange question, Mylo replied, No. How long? Almost 5 years, he continued. For the first 3 years, everything was pretty normal, but things are becoming ever different here. Thomas scratched his head and seemed to be looking around for something. Yes, different, he whispered. He took a long pause and spoke. I'm not sure what is going on, but there have been a lot of strange goings-on in these lands recently. Mylo was perplexed by the instant change in the man's behavior, but was curious as to what he meant. Strange? Queried Mylo. Thomas looked behind him, then to each side to see if anyone might be listening. Strange folk, Doka agents, the secrecy. It's all become strange. They're up to something, those in charge. Something big. There was a long silence between them, and Mylo began to wonder if the man was sane. Perhaps Thomas had been away from home too long. Or maybe too long by himself. Mylo breathed in the fresh pine air surrounding him and denied any possibility that he could become like Thomas. Thomas wasn't done with the monologue. It could have something to do with the missing princess of Westwood, or maybe the discord between the Zoel and Tyrevant. He rambled on and on. Mylo wasn't familiar with Midlandian current events and was not remotely prepared for such topics of conversation, so he kept silent and tried to follow the paranoid rant. Voices and commotion could be heard up ahead, coming from a clearing. As they got closer, the mighty walls began to emerge. Mylo stopped in his tracks, just staring ahead in awe. Thomas, however, kept his pace and continued his rant, not even realizing that he was speaking to no one. By the time Mylo got over his astonishment and started walking again, Thomas was about 50 feet ahead and finally realized he had left Mylo behind. He looked back and waved. He spoke a final inaudible word to Mylo before disappearing to the northwest. Mylo continued toward the city. It was a spectacular sight. The bright green and yellow walls were at least 40 feet in height, with turrets being another 20 feet high. At the top of the walls was a walkway encircling the city. Guards could be seen on the walkway, dutifully observing the activity below. Inside the city were some of the tallest buildings in all of Cameria. 3, which could be seen from outside the city, were 8 stories tall at their tallest point. Mylo came to the southern gate and a guard was there on duty checking people in. "Sign here after you have read the Idriaxlan Code of Conduct," instructed the guard. "If you can't read, someone can read it for you," he reluctantly added. Mylo did as he was instructed and permitted to pass. He made his way north from the South Gate Road. He passed by a small horse stable to his right which smelled as though it could use a cleaning. Across from the stable, to his left, sat a neatly kept field of short green grass that looked as if it was used for sporting events of some kind. A bit farther ahead, on his left, stood the famous Great Library of Idriaxlan. The stone building stood 4 stories tall with 2 of the turrets at 6 stories. The turrets were capped with blue pointed roofs. Its lawn was pristinely manicured with fruit trees and topiaries and flower gardens. The Great Library was known all throughout Cameria and was said to contain every book ever written in all the lands. He had always wanted to visit the library ever since he heard about it as a young child. And now it was there in front of him. But it would have to wait for another day. More pressing matters were at hand. Night was soon coming, and a curfew was in effect for all non-citizens. As he walked along the northern path, it seemed to turn slightly to the right. Mylo paused, scratched his head, and reached into his pack for the city map. He felt around for it, but it wasn't where he left it. He spotted a nearby bench, and he sat to do a more thorough search. He quickly realized that not only his map was gone, but his wallet as well. He began to panic. Did it fall out of my pack? He wondered. Did I set it down somewhere? He thought about going back to look for it in the morning, but if he did leave it somewhere, it would surely be gone by then. Most of the people who he encountered so far didn't look like the types who would try to find the rightful owner of any lost property. Mylo had never been so careless as to lose property, especially at a time like this. He became convinced that someone must have robbed him. But who? Maybe it was that crazy Atlantean, Thomas, or the old man. Or maybe the drunkard. Yes, maybe him. Maybe that little scene was a setup to distract me, he thought. His heart sank as he realized his predicament. Whatever happened to his wallet didn't matter. It was gone. Over 700 Cedros were lost. All that he had left was about 30 Cedros and a few Atlantean gold pieces he had in his wallet. Hopefully it would be enough to get him a room for the night and a meal or 2. "Excuse me, sir. Can you point me in the direction of an inn?" he asked a dark-skinned man in brightly colored clothing. The man only responded with a cautious stare and ushered his family past Mylo. Mylo saw a young man across the road and approached him. "I am looking for lodging for the night." The young man quickly uttered something in another language and kept walking. Everyone seemed too busy or just didn't want to help him. He began to despair as he passed another gate that led outside of the wall's protection. The last thing he thought would happen is that he would have to sleep outside of the city on his very first night there. Darkness started to fall over the city, but the many torches set up on nearly every street fought off the night. Curfew was coming. Fearing that he might get lost if he went further in, he found the nearest bench and sat to try and figure out his next move. "I'll have to sleep outside. It's okay," he thought. "I will find a tree to sleep under and start a fire and come back in the morning." Just then, he looked up to see a sign right across the road. The handcrafted wooden sign beckoned to him. "Vacancy," the sign read. It was a motel. He got up as fast as he could and hurriedly walked through the door. "How much for one night?" he asked the innkeeper. 25 Cedros, replied the man. "Oh, you are an Atlantean. Where do you hail from?" he said, recognizing Mylo's features. "I am from Goodfield." "A town called Finlark," Mylo answered. "I have a cousin from there. My family and I were nomads back in Green Harvest. We moved out here when I was 8 years old. Do you know any of the Potters?" "That is a common name, but I can't say I know any personally." Well, now you do," said the innkeeper with a grin. "I will tell you what. Since it is late and you seem to be a good upstanding Atlantean citizen, the room is yours for 15 Cedros." "Oh, thank you so much," said Mylo as he paid. "Glad to help. Anyway, I was just about to close and wouldn't have made any money on it tonight. It is room number 4, down the hall, just to the left. Now go. Get some rest. You look like you could use it." Mylo walked into the sparsely decorated room, immediately noting a musty odor indicating that the roof had probably leaked at some point. There was an old bed on one side and a chair and plain desk with only 2 drawers up against a window. He sank down in the chair and stared outside at the city. It seemed so quiet. Only a few people were out and about by now. What appeared to be a city guard on horseback seemed to peer at him through the window as he slowly rode by. Mylo continued to look out the window and dream about his future until finally dozing off. The obnoxious blare of the curfew horn nearly startled Mylo out of his seat. He realized what the noise was and gave thanks that he was hearing it in here instead of outside. For the rest of the night, Mylo wrote in his journal, something he hadn't done for quite a while. With a few hours left before dawn, he fell asleep in the chair and slept until he was woken up by the vibrant vitality of the city folk starting their day. He awoke, undeterred by the loss of his money. He got himself ready, grabbed his things, and left his plain little room. He grabbed a paper map of the city from the lobby and said goodbye to Mr. Potter, who never did tell Mylo his first name. The city was already alive with activity by the time Mylo eagerly set off to find work. There were merchants and farmers, some on horseback, some hauling their goods to the marketplaces. The sound of conversation and laughter coursed through the roads and alleyways. There were new scents Mylo had never smelled, accents and languages he had never heard, and skin tones and styles of dress that he had never seen. It was many times busier than the busiest day in the busiest village back home. It so delighted Mylo to see the city alive and in action. Trying not to get too distracted from all the morning hustle and bustle, Mylo marched north to the smithing quarter. As he got closer, there came a change in the sounds and smells. The familiar smell of burning wood and charcoal filled the air. A faint clink-clink-clang of a blacksmith hammer echoed off the walls. The smithing quarter was a city within the city, with its own walls, housing, food shops, and security. It contained within its walls not only blacksmiths, silversmiths, and other metalworkers, but also cobblers, coopers, shipbuilders, and other tradespeople. As Mylo walked through its main gate, the hammering and the smoke became much more noticeable, eventually turning into a metallic symphony of pings, thuds, and dings. To his right, he saw two larger buildings with smokestacks coming out of them, which he assumed to be the smithing forges. Both forges had large signs in the front which read, "Not hiring at this time." At the second forge, a man was walking toward the front door. Mylo rushed over to talk to the man and asked, "Excuse me, sir. Are any forges here looking for help?" "There's one that might be. Straight back that way," said the man quickly before entering the building. "Ask for Mr. Sterk." Mylo found himself in a quieter corner of the quarter. It was a modest building, smaller than the rest, but the flames within burned with a fierce intensity, casting a warm glow over the surrounding area. Sitting at a desk sat a man of formidable stature, grumbling and filling out a work order. The man peered up from his paperwork, happy to have an excuse to get away from it. Even for a moment, he looked Mylo over and spoke. "What can I do for you, sir?" Mylo stood as tall as he could and spoke with all the confidence he could muster. "My name is Mylo, and I am looking for work." "Pleased to meet you." "I am Sterk," said the man, his muscles bulging beneath the sleeves of his leather apron. "Do you have any experience working with metal?" rumbled Sterk in a deep voice. "I ran a family-owned coppersmith business back home." Sterk grunted and scratched his head. "A coppersmith? Iron is a very different lady, you must realize. She can be mysterious, strange. The only metal I know of that is magnetic, and it takes an intense heat to melt her. Do you think you can adapt your skills?" he asked, to which Mylo gave an affirming nod. Sterk brought him around the shop and asked him a few technical questions, which Mylo answered with skillful precision. After realizing Mylo's understanding of the craft, they went back to the office. "I think you will fit right in here. The job pays 600 cedros a week. Be here early tomorrow morning," he said as he trudged back to his paperwork.